Hello and greetings to everyone out in Facebook Streamland. Welcome to Urban Consulate's virtual salon, Destination Reparation. My name is Naima Bilal, and I will be your host for this two-night journey. Destination Reparation was designed to be a multi-part series to create deeper understanding around the serious topic of reparations. It was also designed to increase engagement around the cumulative impacts of slavery, of Jim Crow, and modern day discrimination, and talk about how that has impacted Black people in this country. And the whole idea is to bring about an understanding not only of the need for reparations, the case for reparations, but also the moral imperative for reparations. So you're in for quite a journey. Together, we will also learn about all of the attempts that have worked and those that have been less successful to create reparative action in our country and around the world. And most uniquely, there are a lot of conversations happening around this topic around the globe. But this experience with Urban Consulate Cincinnati adds an interactive component. So tomorrow at 8 p.m., you can join us where we will be led by local equity advocate Eileen Cooper Reed through a digestion of the information and learnings from these two nights. And we'll also be able to dream together and have some imaginative engagement as to what reparations could look like in the future. So we're so glad to have you here. If this is your first time with us, Urban Consulate is a national network for urban exchange. Since 2016, Urban Consulate has hosted hundreds of conversations in Detroit, Philadelphia, New Orleans, Austin, Chicago, and its newest location here in Cincinnati. Our intention is to bring people together and share ideas for better cities. And our work is done through a lens of equity. And so our charge and our purpose has never been so pressing as it is today, as our nation grapples with yet another reckoning of the intractable racial inequities and the truly horrific consequences of racism. Our typical practice is to be in person with participants in the Mercantile Library in downtown Cincinnati, but we're here with you in the virtual space. In Cincinnati, Urban Consulate is made up of a huge production team, designers, audiovisual professionals. Megan Trischler and G. Horton are my co-hosts, and together we work to create and co-create interactive, engaging programming to deepen conversation. And Cincinnati has an interesting history. We're geographically right on the Ohio, and so we lie at the precipice of freedom, and also we historically have always lied right at the precipice of enslavement. And so we see our purpose at Urban Consulate Cincinnati to bring about racial healing and to use our platform and use our voice in a way that can drive and move the needle toward justice, peace, and equity. Our work is enriched and powered by many people. JP Leong is the mastermind behind the scenes. We also have with us some incredible guests. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention philanthropic support that we received from Eric Avner from the Ralph V. Hale U.S. Bank Foundation and our venue sponsor, the Mercantile Library, and all kinds of wonderful behind the scenes support that we get from our many partners. We're very grateful. I'd also like to recognize Claire Nelson, the founder of Urban Consulate, who is joining our call out in Facebook Streamland. So we're grateful to each of you for your vision and for your support. Before we get rolling, we are not actually answering questions live tonight. However, please engage in the Facebook live stream chat. I mean, this is an extraordinary opportunity to digest the information amongst yourselves and react in real time. And we'll be dropping some links periodically in the chat, and so you can engage with that information as well. Tonight, we will begin our conversation with Lauren Hood. She's a community developer and Afro-urbanist. And what's so great about her joining us tonight is that we're going to start out our journey together over these 2 nights to talk about big ideas to build vibrant Black communities. And this is particularly related to reparations because part of reparations is restoration and restitution and returning to a place where Black communities can thrive. And Lauren is going to be casting out a very big vision for us as to what that can look like. Then at 8 o'clock, we'll be talking to William Darity and Kirsten Mullen, authors of From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century, the most comprehensive case to date in literary form for reparations. So they'll give us a 10,000-foot view of the history of slavery, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, modern day discrimination, and then give us some very practical ideas as to how reparations can manifest. So we're really, really excited about everything that we are going to be learning together and engaging in together. And before we invite Lauren into the Zoom room, let's view a short video to start us off. This video is going to help create some context for the journey that we're going to be taking together.
Reparations. It's a term you've likely heard before, but what does it mean? It's a type of compensation given to a group of people who've suffered abuse at the hands of a more powerful group. In the US, it's often talked about in terms of slavery. But slavery was so long ago, and some ask, why should Black Americans be compensated now? Well, proponents argue that the U.S. was built on the backs of slaves, and all our social institutions continue to reinforce rigid economic inequalities against Blacks. It's easy to see why. From slavery, white families got rich, bought land, and cemented legacies, while Black families were torn apart and kept in extreme poverty. From the dawn of America, the starting line for Blacks was far behind the white majority. The Emancipation Proclamation did little to end the racial stigma of being Black in America, and even less to ensure that ex-slaves could access the immense wealth that white America had accumulated off their labor. While all Americans of all backgrounds are deemed equal under the law, equality also means equal access to economic opportunity, healthcare, property, education, and justice. Black people have been systematically denied these things for the past 150 years, and not just by Jim Crow laws in the South. Every major American social institution has roots in slavery. The U.S. school system is still unequal and unofficially segregated. Teachers in minority schools make less money and are less likely to be certified. Black students are often at a disadvantage from day one, and fewer Black boys graduate from high school. 60% of people behind bars in the U.S. are people of color, and Black men are close to 6 times more likely than white men to go to prison. Housing discrimination continues as well. Thanks to old techniques like redlining, which deny home loans and insurance to people living in certain areas, and predatory lending, Blacks have been forced to live in low-income neighborhoods and denied the chance to own homes. Oh, and then there's life expectancy. Black men die on average 5 years earlier than white men. The infant mortality rate for Black babies is more than twice that of whites. Socioeconomic factors like diet, lifestyle, and lack of preventative care all come into play here. So you'd think all of this might make our nation's leaders want to have a discussion about reparations, but you'd be wrong. Congressman John Conyers Jr. has been introducing the same bill for 25 years, calling for a commission to discuss reparations. It's been shot down every time. And while there are many obstacles in the way of distributing reparations, it's not impossible. Take Germany, South Africa, and Chile, all countries that have given reparations to groups of people their governments mistreated. And even here in the U.S., reparations have happened. In 1988, the U.S. began the process of reparations for more than 100,000 surviving Japanese Americans that were placed in incarceration camps during World War II. They can be commissions for collective healing, investment in underdeveloped neighborhoods, access to skills training, or even major legal reforms. There are, of course, many questions, like who would get compensated and what specific problems would be solved. Reparations don't right the wrongs of the past, nor are they a means by which the conditions of people who've been grossly abused are somehow magically fixed. But in a country where the government has yet to formally apologize for slavery, something that began 400 years ago, isn't it time to start talking about what can be done to heal those wounds?
Are we on?
Okay, what an incredibly powerful video. Now is indeed time to start talking about healing our wounds. And I'd like to welcome you to the next segment of Destination Reparation and let you know that we are joined not only by Lauren Hood, but also by an extraordinary artist, Brandon Black, who is a Cincinnatian and a graphic artist who will be recording in real time in visual format some of the information and knowledge that we're taking away from these 2 evenings. Our hope is that Brandon's artistic renderings will be shared on the destinationreparation.com website for us to view after this experience. And hopefully that will deepen our own learning, but also crystallize the information that we're taking in a very, very, I guess you could say a tangible sense, a tangible takeaway. So without further ado, I'm so thrilled to welcome Lauren Hood. Hello.
Hi, Naima.
Hi, so good to see you. And thank you so much for being here. You always bring such incredible vision and thoughtfulness and heart and spirit to this conversation. And there's so much about you starting us out and kicking us off that brings me excitement, because oftentimes this conversation starts here with facts and figures.
Yeah.
But I think we need to start here with the soul and the spirit. So if I could just read a little bit about you, my friend, because you're an extraordinary lady. I'm just going to read out the bio verbatim so people can know the business, okay? Lauren Hood. Number 1, Lauren Hood is, let's see. Who are you, Lauren Hood?
Which bio are we
Lauren, we're going to find out. Lauren Hood is a native Detroiter, an Afro-urbanist working at the intersection of Black aspiration and city change. Applying a reparations lens to her work, Lauren employs the strategies of storytelling, visioning, and relationship building to addressing a community's past harms, present needs, future hopes and dreams. So you can begin to see how Lauren will be playing into this, to our journey here. Credentialed and experienced as both a community developer and equity facilitator, Lauren holds space for otherwise difficult conversations and that allow practitioners and citizen stakeholders to understand and value each other's contributions while working toward transformational outcomes. Welcome, Lauren. It is so good to be with you again.
Thank you, Naima.
So let's just start with a very grounded human question. How are you? And what are you bringing to this conversation today?
Oh, I love that you asked that. I think that is specific to people of certain cultures. I'm finding that some people dive right into work, but in these challenging times, it is usually people of color that are like, no, let me start with figuring out how you are before we jump right into work. So I so appreciate you doing that. And then what was your question?
What are you bringing to this dialogue? What emotions, what feelings, what?
I am bringing curiosity. I think that now is a time where we can really investigate what it looks like to put reparations into practice. It's a moment where people aren't afraid of the word. And I'll even play on some white folks' guilt too. I think it's the time, some individual guilt and some institutional and organizational guilt. Let's use this moment to get all the things that we know that we deserve.
Yes, absolutely. Curiosity is the word that always piques my interest, because you have to be curious to learn new things, right?
Yeah, it's new for me. I have to admit, I have been, treading cautiously in the words I use and how I describe my work. So for me, it's a bold new moment. So I really want to explore all the ways that I can capitalize.
Well, so what's really interesting about the work that you've done, so you've got a background in community development and leadership, like executive leadership in that work. But at some point, you decided to use a framework of reparations to amplify and illuminate and specify your work. can you talk about your passion for community development and when you met that intersection with reparations and why was it useful?
Well, again, I think it is very new for me, and it really centers around just a way of thinking about the work. Um, when I try to assess like what I do, like what my superpowers are and what my skill set is, I think it's around changing hearts and minds. I'm trying to change people's minds about how we think about doing community development and planning. And I think that applying a reparations lens is just a new approach, a new way of looking at the work. So there are a lot of us that understand that communities of color have been systematically harmed, have had policy violence inflicted upon them. There are factors that contribute to the state of Black communities that are not our fault. And I think that is something that cultural others don't understand, but also we don't understand. I encounter a lot of Black folks that have kind of internalized a lot of shame around the way that our communities look. So to me, that says that we need to unlearn what we know about how we got here. And a lot of that has to do with applying a reparations frame, like understanding all the damage that's been done that wasn't our fault, so that you can then understand that you deserve more, you are worthy of more.
Yeah.
You are owed more.
Yes. Yeah. And, you know, when I think about the shame, right, and the blame that we tend to gravitate toward, when it comes to like, you know, evaluating how our communities came to be what they are. And let me be very clear, our communities are filled with love and care and vibrancy, right? So there is a culture that tends to still emerge, although we live under decades of oppression, but it seems that the reparative work starts here, right? It starts kind of from inside and the sort of inner consciousness. So my question for you is, what has been useful to you to break the chains that would keep your dreams about your community and who you are locked up?
Giving people platforms to tell their stories. Super important. I've had so many people say, well, my story is not important. Nobody cares. I'm like, it is. This is where you live. These are your people. You're the only voice that matters. Tell it. Yeah. But after, you know, being pushed to the margins for so long, people have just internalized this lack of self-worth. So I feel like giving people a platform to tell their stories is super important. Also visioning with people. I feel like our current processes are very kind of all tunnel, no light. Like we're just addressing the problems that are at hand. We're not like laying the stage to fulfill our future aspirations. I've asked people like, what do you want for the future? And they're dumbfounded. They're like, I hadn't thought about that because I'm too busy worrying about this thing that's happening right now. So I feel like visioning with people is super important. We never allow people to reclaim our stolen imaginations. You know, we frame the conversation around addressing current issues, and we don't really set the stage for what is possible. Like, how are we going to get to Wakanda if we can't envision it? We need to at least have a conversation about it. You can't achieve it if you can't conceive it. So let's start having conversations and developing processes by which we can start to conceive more abundant futures for ourselves.
Well, so this is a question for you. I'm kind of toying around with this idea that some part of the reason why we've been somewhat limited in our dreaming and thinking about the future is because some of these conversations are not being held and facilitated by us. And so you mentioned Wakanda, and I think that's Marvel Universe. That's not made by us. That is a representation of Black imagination as filtered through a white lens and white gaze. So the question,
right? But there were Black thought leaders in that space.
Yes. Well, sure, of course. Yeah. But I guess the question is for you, like, how can we be the facilitators of dreaming, and what is the specific skill set that you need to facilitate dreaming?
Well, I think you yourself have to have some imagination, and you have to have an inherent belief in the agency that people have. again, it's not just others that don't believe we have agency, that we lack agency. We too have, kind of taken on some of that, of diminishing our self-worth and the value of our contributions. We do that too now. So you yourself have to understand that we have agency and it's something that's been denied us. That's one. But I think that there are a lot of us that have the capacity to do city change work and community building work that don't identify ourselves in that way. I don't think you have to have gone to school for urban planning or community development. There are certain skill sets that you develop just from having the lived experience of being in a Black community. There's ingenuity at every turn. We're always cobbling something together to make something work. These are things that are inherent to us based on our lived experience that is undervalued, you know? So I think that there are things that we naturally do that can apply to us building communities of the future for ourselves. We just have to be able to name them and claim them.
And, we have an incredible legacy. Let's talk about Mansa Musa. Let's talk about the scholars that emerged from Mother Africa. We have a legacy of industry, ingenuity. And so that's something among many, many other things throughout, the annals of
Another
history.
key is, yes, us learning that history, us learning about our ancestors that did this before. That's not something they teach you in planning school.
Right, exactly. But you have to be curious to get all of that embedded into and inform your work.
Curious, worthy, ready to receive.
Ready to receive. That's right. You have the title Afro-urbanist. I wanna tease that apart a little bit. What is Afro-urbanism sort of writ large, and how does that look in practice?
Well, urbanism is kind of an approach to doing city building. And I believe all of those principles are good, like walkability, a certain kind of density. But what it leaves out is culture. And I think that an Afro-urbanist approach centers the culture and lived experience of Black folks in the creation of Black communities. It's always, it drives me crazy, and this is kind of the reason I got into community development, that most of the people leading the work in our communities aren't us. Like, how can you possibly design an intervention to address our issues when you haven't had our lived experience? Like, your very value system causes you to identify things that we wouldn't identify as the real problems.
Right.
I think usually traditional planning and urbanist thought is around the built environment. In my mind, the built environment is just a tool to use in addressing social problems. So you need to prioritize the people and not the property. Invest in people and not the buildings. I feel like really centering our culture in the creation of our communities is at the core of what I mean when I say Afro-urbanism.
So when we were talking a little bit about this prior to destination reparation, you framed this within the lens of vibrant Black communities. When we look through our history, we've had historical and modern day vibrant Black
we've done this before.
We've done this, and yet, at almost every turn, white supremacists have come in and literally massacred, destroyed all of our efforts to create something for ourselves. There's Rosewood, there's Tulsa,
Local to us, Black Bottom. Can I just tell you a story real quick?
Yeah.
So I'm working on a strategic plan process for some East Side neighborhoods.
Yeah.
I led a visioning session and I asked people of all the places in the world that you've actually been to or only imagine going to, like, what is your favorite place? And the first woman that responded said Black Bottom. Yes. Now, everything that I grew up hearing about Black Bottom was that it was dirty. People were living these substandard lives. It needed to be bulldozed, and I'm not sure if you know the history, but you probably do. It was one of the communities, one of the thriving Black communities that was bulldozed for I-75 in particular. But what that said to me was that what that identified for me was that there are different sets of values applied to doing community building. So for her, the vibrant culture that Black swagger that I talked to you about,
Yes.
that sense of self-worth, like that was the thing that she was drawn to with the community. It wasn't about the buildings or the architecture or the streetscape. What stood out for her of all the communities she's ever known about, explored, daydreamed about, was this that the sense of pride from being in a place where the Black person was the doctor, they were the lawyer, they were the hotelier. Just seeing Black folks thriving, and that was the number one thing for her, which reflected back to me that there are a couple different value systems at work when we talk about what community change looks like.
Absolutely. Let's dig into this concept of swagger. What does that look like? And how do you link that to the sort of restoration that comes after reparations?
Well, again, I think it goes back to value systems. So I think with a capitalist European descendant lens, when we say revitalization or restoration, it's like to property and to buildings.
Mm.
But I think folks of color are thinking like, I want my spirit restored. Like, how do you do that?
Mm.
It's really easy to apply money towards rehabbing a building, but what can you put in place that will actually restore my spirit, um, my sense of self, my sense of cultural identity? What I'd like to see in terms of reparation is African American history in schools. Like, can I just know who I am?
Mm.
Can I just be aware of our contributions? I feel
Right.
like all the other stuff will work itself out if we can all get ourselves to a place where we are whole,
Yeah.
and know who we are.
Well, and it's interesting, as a parent myself, I realized I had zero capacity to teach my child about who she was. And it's taken me some years to actually put together the information that would help build up a narrative of her people, what that we've been through as a people,
Yeah.
and where we are today and where we're going. And so I think some of that is just capacity building for each and every one of us to lock that information in, internalize it, and share it with the babies, right? Because
Yeah.
really they're the ones who are going to carry forward.
Yes, and understand like where those resources are and who they are. Like I can think of the one or two people in Detroit that are really like the culture bearers that always get asked to tell us about our history and our culture. But
Yeah.
it's only two people in an 80% Black city that immediately come to mind as being, qualified and available to do that work.
Mm, mm. So I want to go back to this point about swagger. Because when I think about swag, I think about, you're feeling confident and good because of something you're exuding or projecting. And I feel like, the growth of vibrant Black communities tends to kind of coexist with gentrification.
Yeah.
Until gentrification wipes us out and completely moves us out of our communities. So to me, this kind of reinforces the need to create informed voters and an informed electorate, right? So how can we powerfully mobilize ourselves and educate ourselves en masse to resist basically gentrification that gets in the way and corrupts our ability to create vibrant Black communities? How can we do that?
Well, another principle that I think needs to be incorporated into Afro-urbanism is a proactive rather than a reactive approach. I feel like so much of the Black experience is in response to what white folks are doing. At what point do we just get to sit down and say enough,
Right.
and just start from a place of centering our experience and what we want for our futures, and not being responsive, but being proactive.
Right.
So I think that is one way. I do also think, and I've said this before, I think there's some divisions within the Black community that we just have to get over. And I understand them deeply because I've been on my own journey. I think growing up, I was told to distance myself from certain aspects of my culture to be successful. So I understand what I'm looking at when I see Black folks in certain positions of power, or you know, in certain roles, living in certain communities, making a certain amount of money, who want to disassociate themselves from those Negroes. I understand that mentality. I understand where it comes from. And inversely, there's a lot of folks in the grassroots that just assume if you've somehow made it, that you've sold out. So I feel like if we are going to engage or participate in any sort of collective comeuppance, we have to break down those barriers within the race first.
Yeah, yeah. Dr. Kendi talks about that.
Yes, we gotta like coalesce around a shared vision of change. Like we're not gonna agree on all the things, but I believe there are some core principles that we can all get behind.
Yeah, and part of it is just realizing that the table's big enough for all of us. And that brings me back, I think at the edges of that conversation is a scarcity mindset. There's only so much to go around, right? And so we've been taught that for time immemorial, and that has sort of undergirded our understanding of how we share and how we collaborate. On that point of scarcity and abundance, I wanna play a video for our audience here. Because these two words to me, I think, are one of the two of the core words that help orient us around this conversation. So
well, I believe that's why racism exists, because there's a scarcity mindset on a part of the dominant culture. Absolutely. Like we have to keep somebody down so that we can keep all the things. Like we have to ensure that there's a second class of people so that we always have enough.
Yeah, I have to tell you, I'm doing my MBA right now, and just because I was interested in economics and I love economics, and I always understood it to be a study of unintended consequences, but it's really a study of human psychology and behaviors. One of the first things we learn is that one of the core principles of economics is that there is a scarcity of resources, right? And so just that grounding right there puts us behind. So I want to cue up this video really quickly because I think this is a sort of an interesting outgrowth of this conversation.
In 1838, Georgetown University sold 272 people to Louisiana to save the university from bankruptcy.
Among those that were sold were my ancestors.
That university would not be here today had it not been for my grandparents.
That was a long time ago, but the effects of that are still felt today.
There are disproportionate negative outcomes for those who were descendants of slaves that can only be explained by the fact that this enslavement happened, reparation didn't happen, and now is the time.
In October, Georgetown University announced that they would raise $400,000 a year for the descendants of the 272 enslaved Americans that were sold to Louisiana. They said this money will be spent beginning in the fall of 2020.
My family might be making history in the United States.
I might become one of the first in the history of America to receive reparations.
Mechanicsville is the area that is heavily populated with Georgetown descendants, including myself, where I grew up. And Mechanicsville is less than half a mile away from where the plantations were where our ancestors were enslaved. I mean, you had people on very low income. Sometimes they didn't have any income. Some of us have done well if we were able to get out and get an education, and a lot of us haven't. And they could, really use some assistance or help.
We may be the first that receive some form of reparations for slavery.
I don't.
It may start with you.
Well, I think it would be a wonderful thing. Start out with me, and let it continue on with everybody who would be in need. There's so much I missed out on, but from the goodness of God, I'm still here. My mom, I will never forget, had one dress. She'd wash that dress out at night and hang it on the back of her chair to the fireplace to dry, to have it to put on the next day. And my mom, patches on top of patches.
So what do you think that, just maybe one thing you think that Georgetown should do?
Well, my house could be upgraded, for one thing.
In my community where I grew up, reparations would definitely help.
If I was given reparations, I would definitely set some of that money aside for my son's future.
My first thing is to get something for the elderly people.
I would feel that my ancestors are rejoicing in heaven.
It's $400,000.
For each family?
No. It's just $400,000 for over 7,000 people.
No, not much.
Do you think 400,000 come close to what we need as a people? So it's 400,000. Okay, so the descendants that's living now, you put that at how many? About 8,000?
It's about 8,000. It's probably more.
Equal $50. It's a slap in the face, not just a slap in the face, that's a kick in the behind also.
Georgetown University is currently deciding how this money will be spent, but said it will go towards projects that support descendant communities.
I think Georgetown has such an opportunity here to take the lead on this.
I don't think they should go bankrupt, but $400,000 is not going to do it.
Someone in authority at Georgetown needs to come down and actually meet with each descendant and see what each descendant needs.
We don't need to make white people wrong. We don't need to make Georgetown wrong. We need to ask ourselves, what do we need to do to ensure that all of Americans have full access to every right that it means to be an American?
Wow, incredibly moving. What's your reaction to that as someone who helps facilitate sort of excavation of community harms?
Okay, I had to check and see if I wasn't muted. Man, $400,000 is a slap in the face. But in my mind, if you are an institution of higher learning, how about just give all the descendants of slaves a free education, like in perpetuity?
Right.
In my mind, every institution that played a part and somehow benefited from slavery needs to, in their own unique way, provide reparations. So if you're a university, you got to give up some free degrees.
So, but again, it goes back to the scarcity mindset. How can we undo that mindset and embrace an abundance mindset when it comes to this? If we think of reparations as a collective action, as everybody who has benefited from the enterprise having some responsibility, why can't we find abundance in that collectivity?
Well, also, if you think about what real restorative justice practices entail, it involves the person that was harmed determining what should compensate them for their troubles. And I feel like everybody would want something different. Everybody wouldn't ask for a check.
Yeah.
But it's hard to think outside of a scarcity mindset. It's coming at us from everywhere. All the messaging says, be afraid.
That's right. What I love
yours. Yeah.
What I love about the restorative justice framework is that, the person who's been harmed gets to decide. And I think all too often when we talk about reparations, we go right to the conversation about policing, not only what Black people should get, but how they should utilize what they get. We have to resist this urge to
there's an assumption that we wouldn't know what to ask for, what to do with it.
Exactly. And this, Anand Giridharadas in his book Winners Take All, he quotes a Baha'i faith. I think it's an expression in the Baha'i faith that said it is not the responsibility of one party to enact social change on behalf of another. And I think, that might be translated into what some of us identify as white saviorism, right? And so how can we untether from that aspect of dictating what people need and how they're going to use those things?
It again goes back to agency and what we believe about who has it and who doesn't. And I feel like when we're talking about reparations, it's like the gift that keeps on giving. So how then can the compensation be a one-off? You know what I mean? In my mind, it's something that has to be, it has to be sustained over time. So what does that look like?
Yeah.
So even if it was at $50, is that $50 a year for the rest of those folks' lives.
Mm.
Or,
Mm.
yeah, I think it can't just be a one-off because
Right.
we're impacted by racism every day.
Well, yeah.
And we will continue to be. So how can the compensation be a one and done?
That's right. I want to get to something really vital that has to do with you, who you are, your vision about your work. You have a very big, bold vision, and its name is the Wait, let me get it right.
Start with Institute.
Oh, the Institute of Afro-Urbanism. First of all, What is this gloriousness? What is the aim, and why now?
Well, I'll start backwards in answering the questions. So now, because in a post-Floyd world, we can have more bold conversations about what is necessary to get us where we want to go. So that's why now. And what I want the Institute to do is provide programming that restores our swagger so that we can get to creating the communities that we want. So it looks a couple different ways. First of all, I want it to be an institution of learning, but not in a way that traditional universities are. Sometimes that format is intimidating for people. So I really want to remove all the barriers for anybody to come in and learn something, a little more casual learning environment, and at no cost to the folks that really need it. And I want there to be a paid track for practitioners doing work in Black communities. So people that desperately need that cultural context to the work can pay for it because they're already getting paid to do that kind of work. But really broadly is to restore swagger so that we can build our own communities and also empower people that have ideas. So we'd be a source of resources for getting people's ideas out of their heads and into the world.
Yeah, there's a phrase that you used when I was first getting to know you that still is rocking inside of my soul, is that you wanted to create spaces where people go to plan the revolution.
That's right. I haven't used that one in a while, but yes. Well, because in my mind, I was thinking of physical spaces, and physical spaces have been out of the conversation for a minute. But in my mind, yes, we need places where we can go and plan the revolution. Yeah. Maybe now it's a virtual space, but understanding that leaves a lot of folks out. And I'm still trying to work around that. So as all of this activity is happening in the virtual space, as far as community development, what does it look like to wrangle the people that can't meet here? And I still don't have an answer for that. Still trying to figure it out.
You know, the irony of that is that because we are so captive, right, at home during quarantine, there's been more mobilization now in the last, 4 months than I can remember in even like the last several years. And so I don't know, there's some really interesting dichotomy there.
A lot of it was George Floyd.
Yeah.
But a lot of it too is, we have more time to consume content, and there's so much more content right now.
That's
so
right.
Instead of, whereas before I might have gone downtown to see a lecture, like everybody is just online watching, conversation after conversation because we don't have to physically go anywhere to do it.
Yeah. So let's talk about, 10 years from now, right? Lauren Hood's Institute, okay, for Afro-Urbanism. What does success look like? How do you measure your success? And on the other side of that, what are your biggest dreams as to like the tangible outcomes of the Institute's work?
Well, I don't want it to be just my institute. I'm hoping that folks can take some collective ownership of it. And I'm not delivering all the programming by myself either. Right. So it's going to be a team of folks. But what success looks like to me is something like the Harlem Renaissance, something like Black Bottom. It's like, it's a feeling. It's a vibe. It's a way of being. I don't know that it's super tangible in terms of the built environment, but it's certainly a feeling you get when you encounter people in the space. That's being Detroit.
Yeah. So we are at the conclusion of
that already.
Rich. I know. These guys, see, this always happens whenever Lauren is in the room. The dialogue is I'm serious. The dialogue is so rich that you lose track of time. And before you know it, Lauren's usually the one to say, hey guys, I gotta go. And we're like, no, stay, teach us more. But it has been so wonderful connecting with you. Thank you for kicking off our 2-night series, Destination Reparation. And
thanks for having me, Naima. I'm excited to see what happens tomorrow.
Yes, yeah, me too. And thank you. I don't want to underplay how vital it is to have someone who can recognize there is some sort of intellectual engagement with this topic, but there's also the heart piece of this topic that often is dismissed or ignored, for better or for worse, right? So thank you for allowing us to wade in this space, to build and dream together, and to give us a sense as to what that can look like in our lives as practitioners. So want to thank you again, Lauren, for joining us.
For having me.
Thank you.
I appreciate you, Naima.
Oh my gosh, that goes double, triple, a million for me. You're a light, and I don't know. Again, like, I'm going to just say this because I think it's important for people to know, like, the breadth of your work and the way you encompass your work is sort of encompassed. On one hand, it can feel uncomfortable, right? Because you're holding space for these uncomfortable dialogues, but you also always bring us back up to the surface because you cast out this vision and you help us tease out all of the positivity, you know. So thank you for being you. You're incredible. You bring a lot of richness to this movement. So glad to know you. Okay, my friend. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Okay, so that concludes just segment 1 of tonight. Don't go anywhere, friends. We still need you to be here. At 8 o'clock, we are going to come back with 2 incredible scholars, Kirsten Mullen and William Darity. They are the authors of the book, From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. You don't want to miss this. But now's the time for everybody to kind of hang out, maybe take a bio break, and come right back here at 8 o'clock, and we'll start out with Kirsten Mullen and William Darity. Thanks so much for joining us. Urban Consulate. Go to destinationreparation.com to learn all about our guests today. You can also go to destinationreparation.com to register for tomorrow's events if you haven't already. And you don't want to miss signing up for the interactive deep dive into reparations that's going to be facilitated by Eileen Cooper-Reed. Come join us in a Zoom room. We'll have breakout sessions where we can digest this information once again and cast out our own vision and dreams as to how reparations can vastly improve lives of Black Americans. Thanks so much.
Okay, now, from the beginning. Check this out.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Now that my microphone is unmuted, I hope that you were able to have a nice, good break. I hope that the information that you heard, the dialogue that you experienced has given you a good, solid foundation from the spirit, really, and from the heart. Lauren Hood is an incredible, extraordinary person, visionary. If you want to learn more about her work, you can go to laurenhood.com. So we are looking forward to connecting with Kirsten Mullen and William Darity. But before we do that, I want to first draw our attention to another video. And this video provides a very stunning framing, not just for the case of reparations, the case for reparations, but also the moral urgency for healing, for liberation, from our country's intractable relationship with racism and white supremacy. Put simply, acknowledgement is not absolution, and acknowledgement isn't enough. And author and journalist Ta-Nehisi Coates gives a searing and stunning testimony illustrating that very pointedly before the House of Representatives on Juneteenth, 2019.
Yesterday, when asked about reparations, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell offered a familiar reply. America should not be held liable for something that happened 150 years ago, since none of us currently alive are responsible. This rebuttal proffers a strange theory of governance, that American accounts are somehow bound by the lifetime of its generations. But well into this century, the United States was still paying out pensions to the heirs of Civil War soldiers. We honor treaties that date back some 200 years, despite no one being alive who signed those treaties. Many of us would love to be taxed for the things we are solely and individually responsible for. But we are American citizens, and thus bound to a collective enterprise that extends beyond our individual and personal reach. It would seem ridiculous to dispute invocations of the founders or the greatest generation on the basis of a lack of membership in either group. We recognize our lineage as a generational trust, as inheritance. And the real dilemma posed by reparations is just that, a dilemma of inheritance. It is impossible to imagine America without the inheritance of slavery. As historian Ed Baptist has written, enslavement, quote, shaped every crucial aspect of the economy and politics of America, so that by 1836, more than 600 million, or almost half of the economic activity in the United States derived directly or indirectly from the cotton produced by the million-odd slaves. By the time the enslaved were emancipated, they comprised the largest single asset in America, $3 billion in 1860, more than all the other assets in the country combined. The method of cultivating this asset was neither gentle cajoling nor persuasion, but torture, rape, and child trafficking. Enslavement reigned for 250 years on these shores. When it ended, this country could have extended its hallowed principles, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to all regardless of color. But America had other principles in mind. And so for a century after the Civil War, Black people were subjected to a relentless campaign of terror, a campaign that extended well into the lifetime of Majority Leader McConnell. It is tempting to divorce this modern campaign of terror, of plunder, from enslavement. But the logic of enslavement, of white supremacy, respects no such borders. And the god of bondage was lustful and begat many heirs, coup d'etats and convict leasing, vagrancy laws and debt peonage, redlining and racist GI bills, poll taxes and state-sponsored terrorism. We grant that Mr. McConnell was not alive for Appomattox, but he was alive for the electrocution of George Stinney. He was alive for the blinding of Isaac Woodward. He was alive to witness kleptocracy in his native Alabama and a regime premised on electoral theft. Majority Leader McConnell cited civil rights legislation yesterday, as well he should, because he was alive to witness the harassment, jailing, and betrayal of those responsible for that legislation by a government sworn to protect them. He was alive for the redlining of Chicago and the looting of black homeowners of some $4 billion. Victims of that plunder are very much alive today. I am sure they'd love a word with the majority leader. What they know, what this committee must know, is that while emancipation deadbolted the door against the bandits of America, Jim Crow wedged the windows wide open. And that is the thing about Senator McConnell's something. It was 150 years ago, and it was right now. The typical black family in this country has 1/10 the wealth of the typical white family. Black women die in childbirth at 4 times the rate of white women. And there is, of course, the shame of this land of the free, boasting the largest prison population on the planet, of which the descendants of the enslaved make up the largest share. The matter of reparations is one of making amends and direct redress, but it is also a question of citizenship. In H.R. 40, this body has a chance to both make good on its 2009 apology for enslavement and reject fair weather patriotism, to say that a nation is both its credits and its debits, that if Thomas Jefferson matters, so does Sally Hemings, that if D-Day matters, so does Black Wall Street, that if Valley Forge matters, so does Fort Pillow. Because the question really is not whether we will be tied to the somethings of our past, but whether we are courageous enough to be tied to the whole of them. Thank you.
Here we go. What a powerful video. Without further ado, I'm going to welcome our scholars and guests today, Kirsten Mullen and William Darity. They are the co-authors of the book From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. And through their assessment of intergenerational effects of white supremacy on Black economic well-being, Mr. Darity and Ms. Mullen confront the injustices of slavery, Jim Crow, and modern day discrimination to make the most comprehensive case to date for economic reparations for US descendants of slavery, okay? William Darity is an economist with a PhD from MIT and is the Samuel Du Bois, is the Samuel Du Bois Cook Professor, Public Policy, African and American Studies and Economics, and the director of the and director of the Social Equity Center at Duke University. Kirsten Mullen is a writer, a folklorist, and museum consultant, and a lecturer whose work focuses on race, art, history, and politics. Kirsten is the founder of Artifactual, an arts consulting practice, and Carolina Circuit Writers, a literary consortium that brings expressive writers of color to the Carolinas. Welcome, William Darity, and welcome, Kirsten Mullen. Thank you.
Glad to be here.
Thank you so much. I want to start out again with you with a more human sort of grounding question. How are both of you today? And what is bubbling up for you as you come to this conversation tonight?
Well, yeah, sure. Interestingly enough, we were just on a conversation a few minutes ago with the African American Justice Initiative from Kentucky, with Kentucky State Senator Gerald Neal as our interlocutor. And so we're a little bit tired, but we're also energized at the same time, and very glad to have the opportunity to talk with you.
Thank you so much. And I know you guys have been burning the candle at both ends since your book has been released, because you are much sought after for your scholarship. And we are so excited about how your scholarship will help amplify our shared knowledge here at Urban Consulate and our understanding. So let's start out with some definitions, because of course definitions help contextualize the utility of the words we're using, right? So what is the functional definition of reparations that we'll be working with tonight?
Well, for us, it's a program of acknowledgement, redress, and closure for a grievous injustice. And in the context of thinking about reparations for Black American descendants of US slavery, we think about three phases or tiers of American history that have to be taken into account on the ledger for the Bill of Particulars. The first is, of course, slavery itself, but we are loath to refer to the notion of slavery reparations because our view is that the case for reparations is more all-encompassing than slavery alone, despite how horrific slavery was in and of itself. So in addition to the period of slavery, we have to take into account the period of legal segregation in the United States, which was almost a century-long period, what we also refer to as the Jim Crow period, which was accompanied by waves of white terror campaigns that took Black lives, destroyed Black property, or transferred, in quotes, property that was owned by Blacks into white hands. And then the final phase that we have to consider is the period in the aftermath of the passage of the civil rights legislation, where there's a host of ongoing atrocities, including mass incarceration, police executions of unarmed Blacks, discrimination in employment, housing, and credit markets. And then most significant from the standpoint of what we pose as the objective of a reparations project in our book, the massive Black-white wealth differential in the United States, which essentially amounts to approximately $800,000 per household between the average Black and the average white household. Another way to think about it is Blacks constitute about 13% of the nation's population, but only possess about 2.5% of the nation's wealth. And so a reparations project that would accomplish the redress component of such a program would be one that would at least bring the Black share in the nation's wealth into correspondence with the Black share of the nation's population. And so we argue in the text that would require at minimum $10 to $12 trillion of government expenditure.
Yeah. And a little bit later, I hope we can get into a little bit of the economics of reparations and how you cast out a vision for how we pay for that, because that's often a question once we get beyond the point that we know reparations are needed. We need to decide how it's going to happen. But at the opening of this segment, we watched a video, Ta-Nehisi Coates giving this incredible testimonial before the House. I'm just curious to know, and I know a lot of people out there are curious to know your thoughts about HR 40. John Conyers, years before his death, brought it to the House floor every year. But suddenly, it's sort of really deeply embedded into the national consciousness. So the question for you is HR 40 a good starting point? And does it have the promise to move the needle in the dialogue at the federal level?
HR is indeed the starting point that we have. And, but it is, it is the document that, as you said, Representative Conyers put forth 30 years ago. But it needs to be revised. There are some substantive aspects about the bill that need to be changed so that it can become so it can produce the results that we believe a national reparations program must produce. So for us, the primary goal of a reparations program is the elimination of the racial wealth gap. And that wealth gap is not spoken to directly in HR 40. HR 40 also does not specify who the eligible recipients of a reparations program would be. And for us, those recipients must be Black descendants of US slavery. And this is the case because, that 40 acres was a real thing. This was an allocation of land that was promised to the newly emancipated enslaved Black people that was not fulfilled. And, we don't know whether we'd even be having this conversation if those formerly enslaved Black people had been given that, that gift, that land trust. HR 40 also does not have any eligibility criteria. So I mentioned that the target would be Black American descendants of American slavery, but also individuals who have self-identified at least 12 years before the enactment of the legislation or a study commission as Black, African American, or Negro. So we, as we were studying HR 40, we learned that the document has changed. Most significantly in the last 5 years, the number of commissioners has been increased from 7 to now 13. And it indicates that these additional members would probably be selected from an organization that's been involved with reparations, advocacy groups. But we have learned, in fact, that addition was added by an organization called INCOBRA. And, and essentially, they are writing themselves into the legislation, which is curious. When we look at the other, some of the other reparations commissions that have been successful, one in particular would be the commission in the U.S. that was created to examine the unlawful incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. It's a much smaller group, much smaller number of individuals. And so it appears that the number of commissioners who would be impaneled for HR 40 is increased solely for the purpose of allowing INCOBRA and its allies to have seats, which we just sort of curious, like, why is this the case?
Yeah.
At the same time, the remuneration for the commissioners was what is it? It was maintained, right? Yeah. But we think it's really high. It's set at GS 18, which is approximately $200,000. And there's no fixed time for which the commission must produce a report, a final report detailing its findings and explaining, what the next steps would be. The Japanese American Commission took 18 months to do its work. The commission was formed. They conducted research. They had a series of hearings across the country. More than 100 people testified, and they wrote the report all inside of 18 months.
And to the best of our knowledge, the commissioners were not paid. Their expenses were covered, yes, and they had a paid professional staff to support their efforts, but they did not receive individual salaries for performing this type of a national service. And we think that there is an impropriety that becomes apparent when you pay commissioners to conduct what is essentially a sacred mission.
And especially when there's no time frame for the completion of their work. I mean, the commission could, be in existence indefinitely.
Yeah, it's supposed to provide a report to Congress within a year, but it doesn't say that that's a final report. Nor does it say that the commission goes out of existence after it delivers that particular report. So it could tell Congress, we haven't completed our work, that's our report. and then proceed to go on indefinitely. So this is a problem. I will say this, you know, Kirsten and I both thought that Ta-Nehisi Coates's testimony was extremely powerful. And we especially were appreciative of the way in which he took on Mitch McConnell's commentaries about reparations. But what is also kind of odd about that entire hearing is that ostensibly the hearing was about HR 40. It wasn't just about reparations in general. It was a hearing that was supposed to be devoted to a specific piece of legislation. And I think I was the only person, I wasn't there in person, but I submitted written testimony that went into the record. And I think I was the only person who actually talked about the legislation itself. And so from our perspective, for us to have an effective study commission for reparations, we need to restore the size of the commission to 7 persons. All of those 7 should be appointed by Congress, particularly since it's a congressional commission. The commissioner should not receive any form of salary or compensation, nor should the organizations that they might have been associated with receive any form of compensation from the plan. And the commission should be charged with accomplishing at least these 3 objectives. First, establishing that the eligible recipients are Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. Second, that the commission must establish that the goal of the reparations plan will be erasure of the racial wealth differential. And third, that a substantial component, the predominant component of the use of the funds, must be direct payments to eligible recipients. We want the discretion over the use of the monies from a reparations plan to be held by the individuals who merit the receipt of the reparations.
Absolutely. Thank you. I think that the accountability that you are laying out for us very clearly actually demarcates the front line of our work, right? So what I love about your book and your writings is that you have both created such clarity and specificity to help refine our sort of policy considerations. And really it just comes down to adding extra layers of accountability to the work and integrity to the work. So when we talk about reparations, I want to kind of dial it back a wee bit, because I think our audience, many people in the urban hospital audience, that they understand the moral imperative for reparations. They understand the economic need for reparations, given the disparities. But I want to try and talk a little bit about the myths. What I think you both do so well is in your scholarly endeavors, you do so well at dispelling some of these myths. And one of the ones we often hear is, my goodness, slavery was so long ago. Why are we still talking about this? Kirsten, can you give us your most coherent argument or retort of that pushback on reparations?
I'd be happy to do so. You know, when we were conducting research, you know, on this very notion, we learned that when you think about slavery from a generational standpoint, it really wasn't that long ago. And, you know, I myself am on my mother's side in the 3rd generation from slavery. My grandmother, who I knew very well, and my children knew her, was the daughter of a slave. On my father's side, our children are the 5th generation. So, you know, my grandparents knew their enslaved ancestors. And not just 1 or 2 of them, they knew quite a few of them. But we had the opportunity to meet quite serendipitously a fabulous woman, Hortense McClinton, who is the daughter of a slave. Hortense McClinton is alive today. Her birthday is this month. She lives in Silver Springs, Maryland. And I wanted to read a bit.
It should be 105.
No, she'll be 102.
Okay.
102.
Okay.
When we met her, she was 96 years old.
Okay. Okay.
And we saw her last fall in October when we were in Washington, D.C. for a 1619 project event. And had a chance to visit with her and then spoke to her last month. And she's doing extremely well. And we were just so thrilled. I mean, I kept I still have a picture of her as a screensaver on my phone to remind me to get the book finished. You know, so I absolutely wanted Ms. McClinton to see the book. And so
What
we're
was
so
her
grateful.
reaction to your book? I'm curious.
Yeah, we were just so grateful that happened. But I wanted to read from page 241 of our book about her family, the story that she shared with us. Her father was a man named Sabrone Jones King. All right, so we write, Sabrone Jones King, a man with a prodigious intellect and a keen survival instinct, emerged from the shadow of slavery only to find that his successful lumber business made him a target for whites who resented his prosperity and tried to thwart him at every turn. When a white railroad station dispatcher in Kilgore, Texas, this is in East Texas, refused to allow King's hired hands to load his milled timber onto the train for delivery to a buyer in 1924, King confronted the dispatcher. The men argued, and the dispatcher told King he would kill him if he continued to press his case. King is said to have replied, quote, "Well, you'd better kill me quick, because if you don't, I'll shoot and kill you before I hit the ground," end quote. So the dispatcher did not act on his threat. So born in East Texas on January 14th, 1865, about 150 years ago, nearly a year before slavery was declared illegal in December 1865 with the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, King conferred with his parents and siblings after the altercation with the dispatcher. He decided his best option was to pull up stakes and move his young family to Bowley, Oklahoma, one of that state's all-Black towns. King's daughter, Hortense McClinton, who we met, was 5 years old when the family moved to Bowley. In 1966, McClinton became the first Black faculty member hired by the University of North Texas at Chapel Hill.
North Carolina.
I said North Carolina.
Yeah, you're
Text on the brain.
Yeah.
Text on the brain today.
Texas.
She taught in the School of Social Work. Thank you. Vigorous, lively, and vital at now 102 years of age, she recently urged us to finish this book. So Hortense McClinton, the daughter of a slave, is one generation removed from slavery. So we eventually learned of 4 such individuals, right? Who, you know, I think 2 of them died died since the book was published. Yeah. But, you know, some of your some members of the audience may also be aware of the work of Zora Neale Hurston. This is Barracoon, which looks at the last cargo. And so she interviewed early in the 1900s a man named, variously known as Cudjoe Lewis. And so Lewis was on the Clotilda. This was a ship that was carrying Africans from Benin illegally. This is after the slave trade had been outlawed in the US, but they were brought to the coast of Alabama, some 60 odd Africans. And many people know about Cudjoe Lewis because he was the subject of a Life magazine story. And again, her book, which was published, many, many years after her death. But he died in the 1960s. Yes. And then more recently, we've learned about a woman who was on that ship, Ridoshi, who died in 1937. So I believe, they both, my parents could have known both of them, right? So, and certainly when we think about the stories that we know from our grandparents, slavery was not that long ago.
Right. And what is even more stunning is that just because slavery was outlawed doesn't mean that the discrimination ended, So there was, and you talk about in your book, this long legacy. There's another sort of, I think, point of detraction that we've heard on both sides of the political aisle. We've even heard from Bernie Sanders that reparations, he feels, is a divisive thing. I don't know if that's changed since George Floyd's murder. And then we've also heard from, Mitch McConnell, who has said that he finds the concept of reparations to be impossible, unattainable, and unfair. So what do you say to people who say it's unattainable and divisive?
I would say one thing, one of the things that we like to ask people to recall, to think about, in 1819, 1820, few people in this country could have imagined the end of slavery. And yet there were people who were focused on that as a goal, who were doing research, who were writing letters to their representatives, who were actively, helping, Africans escape. But if you don't have people who are focused on these missions, then no, you won't have change. But this is a country, ours is a country where we have had repeated, episodes of tremendous change and upheaval. And oftentimes, there are reversals, in both directions, right? But this is a moment, this is an opportunity for the country to right some wrongs. This is an opportunity for us to take the right path this time. And so, we are hopeful that that is the direction that the country will take in this moment.
I want to take it back to a personal place because in getting to know you both just very briefly, I now know that you are a husband and wife team. And first of all, that's like hashtag couple goals for me to have two scholars joining together in this very important and serious work. But when you cast out your own visions for the impacts of your book, your scholarship, and then implementation of reparations, what is your biggest, boldest dream for what this work can mean for Black people and Black lives in this country? Oh.
A work that, I'm sorry, that it would be a work that would inform directly the type of legislation that would be designed for the purposes of implementing reparations for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery in this country, which would mean paying a debt that has been unmet for 155 years. So our boldest dream is that this is a book that would matter in terms of how a reparations program was actually constructed, designed, and implemented.
Beautiful vision. But part of getting to reparations is undoing some of the lies that we've been told. Kirsten tells an incredible story of a McGraw-Hill textbook where African slaves who were coerced into slavery and brought here were characterized. And this is a textbook that was printed and published and distributed into schools within the last 5 years that characterized those coerced into slavery as coming to America on their own volition, seeking opportunity. So, Kirsten, can you talk a little bit about recasting of this narrative, which for so long has been whitewashed and sanitized to the point of lack of recognition? Can you talk about the work there and how we can move beyond the false narrative we've all been told?
I think it's important to look first at what is being taught in the schools, and to have a real good understanding, of what's happening in your own community, but also across the country. We know from the work of scholars like Jacqueline Dowd Hall that groups like the United Daughters of the Confederacy very determinedly interviewed textbook writers and sought out folks whose opinions were similar to theirs, those that supported the lost cause, that minimized or completely eliminated slavery as a cause for the Civil War, that determined that Black people lived to be enslaved, that was their highest ambition, that Black people were not candidates for education. That they were savage beasts and barely civilizable, suitably for work. And so, we know too that colleges and universities, especially elite colleges and universities, played a major role in developing these tropes of, Black inferiority. Black people's brains and their cranial capacity was smaller than that of whites. That slavery was a civilizing institution. And so we think that they, in particular, bear a responsibility for using their reputation, for using that erudition, using their muscle and might to push for a national program of reparations. We have, it's not that the information is not there. The primary documents exist. They simply were bypassed, for documents that supported this other narrative.
Yes.
So I think it is indeed possible to rewrite an accurate history, but to also talk about this period, so that we can, let's not just whitewash it, but say, this is something that did happen. It's extraordinary to me to see how long-lived these misperceptions were. Some of these textbooks have been in place for 70, 80 years. It's amazing. On the one hand, you have, textbook committees that are not doing their jobs. They're simply just readopting these same inaccurate tomes over and over again. But yes, I think there's a tremendous amount that can be done. We believe that it's essential that a reparations program have a major education component. And we would like to see, American history taught accurately.
Yes.
And that there be legislation that require it to be taught minimally across 3 generations, so that we can, submit this understanding, in the American consciousness.
Yeah.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah. So let me add that I think that there are 2 categories of misperceptions that we invest a substantial amount of time in the book addressing. One are the set of misperceptions that are associated with the history of slavery in the United States, the Civil War, and the Reconstruction era. The 3 points that the lost cause advocates, like the United Daughters of the Confederacy and the Daughters of the American Revolution, have invested a large amount of time and energy in crafting in such a way that we have a false story of the nation's past. But the second set of misperceptions are associated with the way in which people understand why we have racial economic inequality in the present moment. And so one example, for instance, is the belief that the racial wealth gap is something that's attributable to poor savings behavior on the part of Black Americans, rather than the cumulative intergenerational effects of white supremacy taking the form of the denial and deprivation of Black wealth accumulation, so that Black parents and grandparents don't have any significant amount of resources to transfer to subsequent generations. But frequently people say it's, the reason we have this wealth gap is because Black people are too profligate, that they're absorbed with the bling factor. But what the evidence shows for that particular argument, like a host of others that are related, is that actually for a given level of income, white households spend 1.3 times as much as Black households. And in fact, the Black savings rate at each level of income is not very different from the white savings rate. It's certainly not lower. And in some income categories, it's actually slightly higher. So why is it that white households can spend 1.3 times as much as Black households out of a given level of income? It's because they have, at the outset, much higher levels of wealth. I mentioned this disparity between the 13% share of the population, but the mere 2.5% share in wealth. That translates into an $800,000 differential between the average Black and white household in terms of net worth. And that differential is so large that it fully explains how white households can have a similar level of income as Black households, but spend or consume a whole lot more.
And I would add too that average differential didn't happen overnight. We know from the research of the scholar Trina Williams that we have, intergenerational transfers really make a difference when one is trying to accumulate wealth. And Black Americans were not allowed to do so because they were denied the 40-acre land grants, right? This ancestral promise was unfulfilled. What many of us, many people don't know is that at the same time that the formerly enslaved were denied this land trust, whites in America, citizens of longstanding, but also immigrants, were given 160-acre plots of land in the Western Territory. This was part of the colonial effort to displace Native Americans. But these were, opportunities for whites to become landowners, to become farmers. They might become developers, they might decide to subdivide the property, sell part of it, live on part of it. But this was a grub stake. This was a nest egg that they had. This was something that they could borrow against. It was a hedge against all kinds of problems that could befall you and your family. If you knew that you had 160 acres of land, you might make a decision to invest in a business opportunity, or you might decide to purchase an investment instrument that you might not have even considered before. So the kind of options that one had as a consequence of this federal policy that was made available to whites but denied Blacks makes a huge difference. And we know that wealth captures the cumulative intergenerational effects of white supremacy. Whites were allowed to transfer these resources across generations, and Blacks were not. I mean, we really don't know what the consequences would have been if Black Americans had been allowed to have that 40 acres. 160 would have been even better, but they were denied even the 40 acres, but also if they had been protected. I mean, we also know that the Union military forces were withdrawn across the South, and Black Americans were left to fend for themselves, right? And what happens, because they weren't armed, is this horrible stretch of terror. Lynching campaigns. Some of the more prosperous of the Black communities were burned out, both the residences and the businesses. And the U.S. government, on some occasions, did interfere, but for the most part, they absolutely did not. And in some cases, it could be argued that they participated in these atrocities. So, yes, there's a lot that could be different, but there's absolutely, there are concrete reasons that explain how we got to where we are today and why the racial wealth gap is so large.
So I want to kind of pivot here, because so much of this conversation centers on culpability. And one of the threads that we find throughout the book is the vital role that the federal government played as the locus of discrimination, white supremacy, and the scaling of those terroristic impacts on Black lives. And in your book, you make it very clear that you feel that it's the federal government that holds the responsibility to right these wrongs and to reverse the course of intergenerational disenfranchisement and discrimination. So can you talk a little bit about that? You placed a price tag on this. You said $800,000 per descendant.
Per household.
Sorry,
Per household.
per household. I'm so sorry.
Probably-
$800,000 per household. Let's get that right.
It's probably closer to $250,000 to $300,000 per eligible recipient.
Got it. Okay. And so that when you extrapolate that out, that's a tens of trillion, what, 12 to $10 trillion expenditure. How do we pay for it? And what is the mechanism that you are proposing that we do to finance that debt?
So we pay for it the way we pay for anything. I think it's really become clear in recent days that the federal government can come up with huge sums of money to spend without raising taxes. The expenditures in the midst of the coronavirus crisis, depending on how you compute it and whether or not you include what the Federal Reserve has done, range anywhere from $2.5 trillion to $6 trillion, and that was coughed up virtually overnight. And people are saying that more needs to be spent in the midst of the economic crisis or collapse that we're experiencing now. So we would argue that that's the same way in which a reparations project would be financed. From our perspective, the federal government is not tax constrained in the way in which state and municipal governments are constrained. That the real limitation to additional federal spending is the potential inflation risk. And we talk in some detail in chapter 13 of our book how you might design a reparations project so you could minimize the adverse inflationary factors or the adverse inflationary effects. So our argument is you just go ahead and make the deposits into people's accounts. And that's how you do it. You just want to make sure that you make those deposits in such a way that you don't trigger significant price inflation.
Yeah. So one thing that's tied to this is something you mentioned earlier, which is our tendency to not only moderate the pace, method of reparations as in terms of how they're delivered, but there's this tendency to police how those funds would be used. And Kirsten, if you can just talk about this notion that we should dictate how recipients of reparation should spend that economic infusion.
So we spent some time analyzing successful reparations programs around the world. And when you look at the reparations that were paid to the Holocaust victims, when you look at payments that were made to Japanese Americans who were unlawfully interned during World War II, when you look at the victims of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, where the United States was not the perpetrator, but decided for political and for humanitarian reasons they needed to act. And when you look at a more recent case of the Sandy Hook, Newton, Connecticut shooting massacre case in schools, all of those cases, payments were made directly to individuals. Now it's interesting, on 2 of those 4 cases, Kenneth Feinstein, who was the special master for the 9/11 Victims Fund, made an interesting decision. He was given carte blanche to determine who would receive reparations and how much. There's actually no precedent for a reparations program of this type. John Ashcroft named him special master, and he proceeded to develop a reparations program as he saw fit. Feinberg made the decision that he would base the amount of money those individuals received on their contemporary, the contemporary salary, so what they were making at the point in which they died. So let's say, for example, you were in graduate school and you were working on your MBA, and you had already been promised a job that paid, maybe 6 or 7 figures, but at the time you worked as a research assistant at a university. So your pay, your claim would be based upon what you made that day, right? So if you were a courier, working in the FedEx office on the lower level of the World Trade Center, your pay is based on the, I don't know, $8, $10, $12, $15 an hour that you burn. If on the other hand, you were an arbitrageur, a financial manager for Cantor Fitzgerald on the upper floors of the World Trade Center, and your salary was close to or above $1 million, your claim was based on that figure. So Feinberg basically baked inequality, wealth inequality, in the payments. Now, he subsequently said that that was a mistake, that if he had the chance of a do-over, he would award the same amount to all of the claimants. And we think that's the right course to take.
Yeah.
It's interesting too, he was brought in to help arbitrate in the case with Sandy Hook, because there was a tremendous amount of division between the families and several organizations that were, trying to be of assistance, the United Way and several others. And, there was a conversation about whether or not funds should be expended to create a community center. I can remember, there were 26 victims of this atrocity. 60,000 teddy bears arrived in the town, which strikes us as just a bit odd because the children were deceased. So there was just a lot of, sort of misdirection. But after listening to the parents and members of the community in Sandy Hook talk about, their concerns, Feinberg became convinced that even more so than in the case of the 9/11 victims, that the funds should go to the families, not to not to community centers, not for programs for therapy. The families can decide if they want to erect a memorial in their children's names. The family can decide if they want to create a program on bullying in their children's schools, etc. But he felt that absolutely the money should go directly to the family. This is how we deal with injuries in our court systems. We discuss what the harms were. We create some kind of a value. There are forensic economists whose job it is to determine what the value is of the property or the lives that were lost, and that's what's paid. And so I was reading everything I get my hands on that Feinberg had written. I thought this man is a hero. I actually had a chance to meet him last November. And so I was asking him about Black reparations. And he shocked me by saying, "Oh, terrible idea. Terrible idea. This should not happen."
Was it really a shock?
It was. It actually was. I couldn't believe my ears. And his arguments were twofold. On the one hand, he was saying, it's impossible to determine who should receive reparations. It would be so divisive.
So he didn't know who he was talking to. Somebody who had thought very carefully about how you can actually identify who the eligible recipients are.
Right. And he didn't give me a lot of time to explain that part, but that was one of his arguments. And the second argument that he gave was that whites, during the antebellum period, that poor whites had been disadvantaged because they were competing for jobs that enslaved Africans held. And so when I tried to talk to him about, this whole phalanx of dependencies that these whites had, and how many of them, owned slaves or part of families that owned slaves, he just, was kind of taken aback and just did not compute for him. So, it's interesting, to note that, in the he was also brought in to arbitrate in the case of the victims of the Boston Marathon bombing. And so it's fascinating to see that in all of these other instances, direct payments to the victims is what was determined essential. But when the recipients are Black American descendants of U.S. slavery, suddenly that's no longer.
So I think it's interesting, like if that consideration is less of an economic consideration and more of like a human psychology consideration. We don't have enough time to get into that sort of willful dissonance. I'm not a psychologist and I can't pretend to know, but I have a sense that it has something to do with the pain being so great that you cannot face the history of our nation. We are taught a falsehood about who we are as a people. And I think so much of paying reparation means that the sins of our past are true and that we are indeed on the hook, so to speak, to right those wrongs. But as we close out here, I mean, this has been incredible wealth of information. What's at stake? If reparations aren't implemented, aren't taken seriously, what does that mean for the very soul of our nation? What does it mean for the ongoing well-being of Black people in our country?
I mean, the term you used was the soul of the nation. And the soul of the nation has never been whole or sound, never. I mean, from the very beginning of the Republic, because the Republic was formed as an instrument of white supremacy. It starts as a nation that is a slave republic. And so, from that point on, the country has never really addressed the harms and damages that it has inflicted on a large segment of its population that was brought here forcibly, that was subjected to enslavement, that was then subjected to nearly a century of legal segregation and white terror campaigns, and is still being subjected to atrocities and inequalities in opportunity and well-being. And so you're quite right that the soul of the nation will not be healed until reparations are made. Now, if we were concerned about other dimensions of national life, I think I'd be harder pressed to make a case that reparations is something that would necessarily be beneficial for every American from a material standpoint. But we certainly could conduct a reparations project without placing any significant economic penalties on any American citizen, particularly if we finance it without increasing people's tax burden.
Yeah, so I think that, Black people have held firm, to this promise and the hope, of our nation's ideals. We have this 155-year-old debt, and it's time for racial justice. But I think it's not insignificant that at every stage, Black Americans have been saying, in every way they know how, this is who we want to be. This is who we say we are. can we step together into this, this future and realize what, the forefathers of this country, idealized.
Yeah.
We've never been willing to actually embrace it all, but there's always been the possibility that we could do so. And I am someone who is by nature a hopeful person, and I very much hope that this is a moment where we are prepared to do that work.
I'd like to,
sorry, go ahead. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that one of our favorite writers from the late 19th century, or the mid to late 19th century, was Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. And when President Lincoln was proposing repatriation of Blacks to the African continent, she gave a response that I think resonates to the present moment. She said, "Let the president be answered firmly and respectfully, not in the tones of supplication and entreaty, but of earnestness and decision, that while we admit the right of every man to choose his home, that we neither see the wisdom nor expediency of our self-exportation from a land which has been in large measure enriched by our toil for generations, till we have a birthright on the soil and the strongest claim on the nation, for that justice and equity which has been withheld from us for ages, ages whose accumulated wrongs have dragged the present wars that overshadow our head." And so we conclude after that quotation, Blacks would stay and demand full justice in America.
Absolutely. And on that note, I want to bring this to a close and thank you both for, in reading your book, I reflected on it recently, and it's comprehensive. There's a lot of history there, but the way you've written it is very lyrical and it makes it an easier read. It's not an easy read from a content standpoint because there's a lot of very difficult, facts to digest there. But the way you convey it does convey a sense of hope. And thank you for fixing that hope within this literary piece of scholarship. Thank you for your contributions to this movement. And thank you for joining us tonight, Kirsten Mullen and Sandy Darity. We are so honored to have you with us. And if people want to find out more about your work, your scholarship, can you give us maybe your social media handles, or how can we follow you and follow your work?
I can be reached on Twitter as @Sandy Darity, SandyDarity. And I'm probably there too much.
We love that. We need a Twitter presence from you.
Kirsten, do you have an email address you would share? Your email?
No pressure, really. So go ahead.
Thank you. So we talk a lot, the two of us.
Yeah.
And so I will
leave it on me.
I will leave the Twitterverse works. The Twitterverse is active. Yeah.
That's fair. Well, thank you again so much. We will leave you to your evening. It is, oh my gosh, it's 9:03 p.m. and we've done a lot of talking. So thanks again for your scholarship, and we are so glad that you've joined us tonight. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Good night, Taylor.
Good night.
Bye-bye. So if that wasn't the deepest dive that you can get about the topic of reparations in 1 hour, I don't know what else could have been. I mean, this is incredibly important information to know. And because information is always editing itself and it's always changing, we're hoping that this touch point for you is an opportunity to build upon what you already know. And maybe for those who are coming to the topic, serious topic of reparations for the first time, we hope that this has provided you a solid foundation to spur your curiosity. So to close, I want to thank everybody who's joined us tonight. Lauren Hood, Brandon Black, oh my goodness, Kirsten Mullen, William Darity. We are bringing to a close night one, but the journey is not over. Join us back here tomorrow at 7 o'clock when Dr. Tia Gaynor and Dr. Brandy Blessed will be moderating a panel discussion featuring individuals from across different sectors who will give us snapshot visions of what reparations can look like across a multidisciplinary scope. We're really excited to welcome Michael O'Brien, Rachel Knox, and Jerry Neri. Please join us at 7 o'clock tomorrow. DestinationReparation.com if you are not yet registered for that. And most importantly, want to be sure you join us for the interactive Destination Reparation experience. That happens at 8 o'clock tomorrow, Tuesday, August the 11th. You'll want to register for this because unlike this experience, the interaction will take place inside of a Zoom room. So you're going to need a Zoom link and you're going to need the meeting ID and all of that. So go to destinationreparation.com and we will see you back here tomorrow at 7 o'clock. Thank you.